In this video, we're going to be ranking all 50 US states based off of their 2024 college football teams. Typically, the teams in your own state are your biggest rivals or teams you just don't like playing against. But in this case, you're going to be rooting for those teams to have success and be a team that's able to help support your state and climb them further up the ranking. So hopefully this video can help instill a sense of state pride into some of you guys. And before we get into this ranking, we'll have to go over some of our rules and criteria. The first rule is every FBS team in the state will be considered. It doesn't matter if you're Ohio State and just won a national title or Kent State and just went winless. If they're both in the same state, they're both going to be considered in the ranking. Depth is required here. You've got to have good teams across the state. It can't all be reliant on one team. The other rule is going to be that if a state has 0 or 1 FBS schools, then FCS schools will be used, if there are any. There's a few states where they actually don't have any FCS schools and they only have 1 FBS program. There's a few states where there's no programs at all. We'll talk about that in just a second. FCS schools, when they're used, are going to be weighed just a little bit less because the FCS is obviously a lower division of football. An FCS title isn't going to be treated the same as a FBS national title. So that's something that happens there. But a good FCS team isn't going to weigh down a state just for being an FCS school, if that makes sense. And then finally, this list is based solely on how good/accomplished they were in 2024. It doesn't matter if it's a historically great program or a blue blood. If they had a rough season this year, it's going to weigh down the state most likely. So without further ado, let's get into the ranking starting at number 50, where we'll actually reveal 50 and 49, Alaska and Vermont. Alaska taking last place, Vermont taking 49, but it's semantics, honestly. They could flip-flop because neither one of these states has an FBS or FCS football program, and it's kind of a sad thing, but it makes sense logistically speaking in Alaska. And then in Vermont, it's just a thing where they haven't had it. Vermont formerly had one, and that's the only reason they get the spot one above Alaska for now, but that's going to pit them at the bottom of this list. But if we reveal the next 3, we'll see next is Maine. Maine has 1 FCS program in the Maine Black Bears, who had a pretty pedestrian season this last year. They weren't great or anything, and that's why they're pinned at number 48. At 47, we have the state of Delaware, which has the Delaware Blue Hens, who are essentially pulling all of the weight for this state. They had an 8-win season this last year. They were ineligible for the postseason due to them transitioning to the FBS level, but a really solid season for them, and that's one that gives this state a little bump. Delaware State, however, really dragging down what Delaware did. They are just a terrible poverty team at the FCS level, and their terrible record is the reason that this state falls at number 47. At 46, that's where we have Rhode Island, where Rhode Island had a really great season, gets into the playoffs, and they are held back though by Bryant and Brown. Both teams not very good, some of the worst the FCS has to offer, but because Rhode Island had a little bit better of a season than Delaware, that's why we give the state of Rhode Island the spot at number 46. Coming in at number 45, we have the first state that features an FBS team, which is going to be Wyoming. Now, Wyoming was one of the worst teams in college football this last season. They end up going 3-9 and winning a couple conference games late, but it was still just a pretty disappointing year for the Cowboys, and it's the reason the state falls at 45. There's no FCS school, there's no other school in this state that helps out Wyoming, so Wyoming takes that spot there. At 44, we have the state of New Hampshire, where both University of New Hampshire and Dartmouth turned in really exciting good seasons, and so that's enough even at the FCS level to jump over Wyoming and get that number 44 spot, which is pretty impressive for a state that only has FCS schools, but there's still more of those states to come. At 43, we've got the state of New Mexico. Now, this state typically falls pretty low on this list, but New Mexico actually had a really resurgent season this last year. The year prior, New Mexico State had a great year, so this state has had a bit of a renaissance recently. Now, New Mexico State didn't quite hold up their end of the bargain this last season. They end up only winning a couple of games, but New Mexico was close to a bowl game, had some nice players, and so that's why they're a little bit higher than Wyoming is, because New Mexico was a little bit better in that same conference, and New Mexico State wasn't any worse than that. Now, from 43 to 42, we make a little bit of a jump because Boston College is in the state of Massachusetts. They actually made a bowl game, won 7 games in the year. They end up losing that bowl game, which hurts a little. And then there's UMass, which is definitely going to be anchoring down this state a little bit. Not a single FBS win for UMass this last season. They had 2 wins, both were against FCS opponents, so that program going to have to turn around in future years if they want to end up helping out their state in the long run. And then finally, at number 41, we have the state of New Jersey, the birthplace of college football, where we've got Rutgers and we've got Princeton. Rutgers also won 7 games this last year, making a bowl game. It was a successful year under Greg Schiano. And Princeton finishes below 500, wasn't as good, but I'd say on a similar tier to UMass. And then I just give Rutgers the edge over Boston College. UMass's zero FBS wins, I feel like, is just enough to not give Massachusetts the edge over New Jersey here. But I could hear the argument, but it's semantics. It's 42 and 41, so I'm not going to lose much sleep over the placement of these two states. So let's start to get our way into the top 40. At number 40, we're going to have Hawaii, another state that only has one team, FBS or FCS. It is the Rainbow Warriors, and they end up finishing a game below 500, missing a bowl game altogether. They played 2 FCS opponents, so they ended up with only 3 FBS wins on the table this year. But what they have over New Jersey and Massachusetts is they don't have a terrible team holding them back. It's just Hawaii, who is a little mediocre. At 39, a very similar story. Wisconsin ends up missing a bowl game this season, ends a really long bowl streak for them, but as the lone team in the state, they're going to get number 39 for their mediocrity, just keeping them there. At 38, we have the state of Oklahoma. This is a really strong football state most times, but this last season was a disaster. Oklahoma State doesn't win a single conference game. They go 3-9. Tulsa was one of the worst teams that the American Conference had to offer, and Oklahoma ends up finishing below 500. Despite a few bright spots this last season, they finished 6-7 with the loss to Navy in the bowl game. So 38 is going to be a spot for this state with 2 bad teams and one team that was average, maybe a slightly above average, but their record's certainly not pretty. And so that's what lands the state of Oklahoma all the way down at 38, a really down year for them. At 37, we're going to get Nebraska, where the Cornhuskers make a bowl game and win a bowl game. And because there's no bad team to anchor them down, they're going to get spot number 37. At 36, we're going to get Minnesota. Minnesota with a really strong finish to their season that was good enough to get them this spot. And then there's the St. Tommies at the FCS level. They finished at 500 this last year, so nothing too crazy. I feel like it does weigh down Minnesota's accomplishments a little bit, but nothing that takes them below the status of a state like Nebraska or Oklahoma. So Minnesota getting spot number 36. We jump ahead to the next 5 here. We've got number 35, which is Connecticut. Now, Connecticut has a few more teams at the FCS level than I think people realize. There's UConn at the FBS level, and then Yale, Central Connecticut, and Sacred Heart, all at the FCS level. Yale and Central Connecticut are actually pretty decent this last season, and okay at the FCS level. Overall, still, though, weighing down the accomplishments of the 9-win UConn team, who did have a little bit of an easier schedule, but still a strong showing from the state of Connecticut, who's definitely fallen lower on this list in seasons past. And then at 34, we've got the state of Arkansas. 2 FBS programs here in the Razorbacks and the Red Wolves, and both teams had solid seasons. Both teams finished above 500. Really good for this state based on where they finished historically speaking, and so they get spot number 34. However, still behind a couple of states with all FCS teams, and there's a couple of them, and they're super strong. At 33 is the state of North Dakota, where North Dakota State just won the FCS National Championship, and that is worth quite a bit. Like I said earlier, it's not worth as much as an FBS title is, but still carries a ton of weight. The only issue in this state that's typically the top FCS state is North Dakota didn't quite hold up their end of the bargain this season. They lost a few games they probably shouldn't have and end up affecting how high that state can rise. But still, 33, nothing to be ashamed of, especially when there's so many states that are stacked with FBS teams. At 32, we're going to have the state of Nevada, another one that has been surging recently. UNLV really carrying things this year as Nevada ends up going winless in conference play, ends up only winning 3 games on the season. So UNLV essentially carrying. They were really strong. They were in the top 25 most of this season, but like I said, just being counterbalanced by Nevada with their inclusion there. And that takes us to 31, which is another state that has 2 FCS schools, and that's going to be Montana and Montana State. And both these schools had a really solid season, and that is what gets them up to number 31. They don't have quite as weak of a link as North Dakota has with University of North Dakota, and that's why they get a couple spots above them. Coming in at number 30, we have the last state with no FBS schools, which is South Dakota. The Jackrabbits obviously have been a phenomenal team at the FCS level over the last couple of seasons. They end up coming just short because of North Dakota State. But then there's South Dakota, who also was phenomenal and also made a deep playoff run. So the state of South Dakota, despite the fact that they lost some of their bigger games, and South Dakota State lost to North Dakota State several times on the season, still a state that overall was just stronger than Montana or North Dakota this season. So they take the crown as the top FCS only state. So that's a pretty impressive feat by South Dakota. And even if you were to just look at FCS states, South Dakota is pretty clearly the strongest with their 2 schools they have. So getting into the top 30 at number 29, we have the state of Michigan, another state that has seen some stronger years, but always is usually held down a little bit by the directional Michigan schools in the MAC, Eastern, Western, and Central Michigan. 2 of them ended up missing a bowl game this year, and Michigan State ends up missing a bowl game, and Michigan having a little bit of a down year this year. Yes, they finished the season pretty strong, and that honestly does a lot for their ranking here, but they're going to end up at 29, which is definitely a down year for that state. At 28, we have the state of Mississippi, where Ole Miss was a really strong team and a contender in the SEC, and a team that won some big games this last season, but Southern Miss was the worst team that the Sun Belt had to offer, and then Mississippi State was the worst team the SEC had to offer. Both were bad enough to weigh this down. I honestly think the fact that they even get to number 28 is just a testament to how good Ole Miss was with the win over Georgia, but even Ole Miss had their moments and their gaffes this season. So 28 ends up being where they fall. It's definitely a disappointing season for this state, where if we think back to some of those early playoff years like 2014, the state of Mississippi might be the number 1 state, which is pretty crazy, back when both of those programs in Ole Miss and Mississippi State were at pretty high efficiency. Coming in at number 27, we're going to have the state of Virginia. Virginia, another state that I'd say had a little bit of a down year, with Virginia Tech and Virginia both finishing below 500. Virginia missing a bowl game altogether. Old Dominion ends up missing a bowl game. James Madison and Liberty end up both having pretty records, but James Madison kind of missed some of their opportunities throughout the season, and then Liberty also wasn't super great. They were probably the worst 8-win team in the country. They end up losing their bowl game. There just wasn't a ton of bright spots for Liberty. In fact, there's more dark spots that you think about, like their loss to Kennesaw State. So Virginia gets the number 27 spot. Another one that is stocked full of FBS programs that you expect to be higher on this list typically, but just a little bit lower. And that takes us to number 26, where we have the state of Missouri, which is basically Missouri carrying this state, and then 3 FCS schools in Lindenwood, Southeast Missouri, and Missouri State. However, what I will say this last season is the FCS schools pulled a little bit of their weight, and that is what allows Missouri to charge up to the number 26 spot. Finishing with 10 wins is obviously a huge boost for the Missouri Tigers, and then Missouri State, Southeast Missouri turning in some really solid seasons, and that's the reason that this state is able to claw their way up to number 26. And this gets us into the top 25, where at number 25 we have Idaho. Boise State obviously makes the run to the CFP. I thought they competed well against Penn State and Oregon in 2 of their biggest games, so I think a really great team in the Broncos. They obviously had Ashton Genty, and then you look at Idaho. The Vandals were an excellent team this last season. Idaho State could be doing a little bit more, but to me, that's enough for them to get the spot 1 above Missouri, which is a strong FBS performance and a couple of FCS teams trying to supplement as best as they can. Now, 24 may end up surprising some people, because when you think of states and how good they are at football, California is one of the first that comes to mind. But let me tell you, this was a down year for the state of California. Get a load of this. Stanford misses a bowl game, UCLA misses a bowl game, San Diego State misses a bowl game, and then outside of that, Cal finishes 6-7 with the bowl loss. Fresno State ends up disappointing in the Mountain West this season. San Jose State does get to a bowl game and has that crazy game versus South Florida in Hawaii, and then USC ends up ending on a high note with the win over Texas A&M, but still an unimpressive season where they did not meet a lot of their goals. So none of these teams really broke out or had crazy seasons. Not a single team on here finishes in the top 25. It was a down year for what's typically a very proud state in California when it comes to college football. Coming in at number 23, we have the state of West Virginia. Now, West Virginia didn't do anything crazy special except for win a conference title, which is honestly the huge thing they can hang their hat on here with Marshall pulling that off. Now, they end up having the turmoil. They don't play in the bowl game. Does that affect Marshall's season in terms of how we look at it? Yeah, a little bit. West Virginia themselves, the Mountaineers, didn't necessarily pull their own weight. They end up missing a bowl game. This state could have had a much better performance if they didn't do that, if they went and made a bowl game, maybe had a good season under Neil Brown. But Neil Brown's gone, and Marshall, ironically, doesn't have Charles Huff anymore either. But that's not necessarily factored in here. Still, overall, I'd say a positive season just because of the weight Marshall pulled by getting that conference championship victory. At 22, however, we have a state with a little bit less volatility. You've got Washington State and Washington. Washington State finishing with the 8 wins on the year. Washington finishing at 6-6 in the Big Ten with a difficult schedule, and I acknowledge that. And so Washington State was in the top 25 at one point this year. Washington certainly had some bright spots and some solid wins over big teams. I'm thinking about their win over Michigan. I'm thinking about their win they had over USC as well. So both of those schools, I think, definitely decent seasons. Wasn't some of the highs that we've come to expect from these two programs, or from Washington at least over the last couple of seasons. A bit of a transition year for them, but 22 still a respectable spot, all things considered. Coming in at number 21, we have the state of North Carolina, another one with 6 FBS programs, and typically expected to be a lot higher on this list, especially if you looked in the preseason. You would have said, wow, NC State, North Carolina, App State, Duke. There's a lot of teams that could have good seasons this year, but then you look at what actually happened. NC State and North Carolina both finished 6-6, were some of the worst teams to make it to bowl games this year in the power conferences. App State misses a bowl game. Wake Forest misses a bowl game. East Carolina and Duke were really the only saving grace of this state, and the reason they're able to get to that number 21 spot. Duke turns into 9 wins. East Carolina ends up turning an 8-win season, so there was some disappointment in this state, but still 21 a respectable spot. Getting into the top 20, we're really starting to get to some serious states here. And at number 20, we have the state of Maryland. Maryland carried by Navy, which was a surprise this season. But the way Navy stepped up in a lot of their biggest games this season, beating a team like Memphis, beating a team like Oklahoma in the bowl game, it was really impressive. Beating Army for the Commander-in-Chief trophy was also a highlight for Navy this season, and a reason they're able to get their state up to number 20. If Maryland had a good year, we could have seen them rise pretty high, but Maryland doesn't have a good year. They miss a bowl game, and I think that ultimately ends up holding this state back a little bit. They weren't the worst team ever. There were a few moments where they had bright spots. They beat USC in the season, but definitely something that holds this state back. And you could even argue Maryland goes down maybe a few more spots, but I really thought Navy had a better season based on their accomplishments than really any other team in like the 4 states below them: North Carolina, Washington, West Virginia, and California. At number 19, we have Colorado, which has the Buffaloes of Colorado, Colorado State on here, and Air Force. Air Force ends up missing a bowl game, but they were one of the better teams to do so. They ended on a 4-game winning streak in the regular season. Colorado State was in Mountain West title contention for a lot of the year, and Colorado was in Big 12 title contention for a lot of the year. And also having the Heisman winner on Colorado, that's a huge accolade for them in this state. And so I really think it evens out to a pretty solid state overall, just when you look at the fact that there wasn't really a bad team in this state, and their 2 top teams had pretty solid years. 1 spot above them, though, it was a close call. Put the state of Utah. Obviously, BYU had a better season than Colorado. They beat them up in the bowl game, which ultimately was kind of one of my deciding factors because they won that game so handily. With that being said, Colorado did beat Utah, but the way I look at it, you've got 2 power conference teams. Utah maybe slightly better than Colorado State this last year, despite the fact that they missed a bowl game, but they did have that tougher schedule in the Big 12. And then you've got Utah State, who probably a little bit worse than Air Force, arguably. So it's a pretty close call between these 2 states. I think the margins are thin, but I look at that emphatic BYU win over Colorado and I say, that might just be just enough for me to be convinced to move the state of Utah up to 18, 1 spot above Colorado when I'm measuring them head to head. 1 spot above that, we've got actually 2 spots above that. Both of them, we've got similar dynamics to the state of Utah, where you've got 2 FBS programs and a group of 5 program. I should say 3 FBS programs, but 2 power conference and 1 group of 5 is what I meant to say. But at 17, we have the state of Kentucky, where Kentucky has a bad year, but Western Kentucky puts together a really solid season, gets to the conference title game in the CUSA, and Louisville has a really solid year under Jeff Brom. So they're going to get the spot 1 above the state of Utah. I just thought Western Kentucky making a conference title game was enough to offset the fact that Kentucky was maybe a little bit down this year. They might have been on a similar tier with Utah when you compare those 2. And then one spot above, you're going to be talking about the state of Illinois, where Illinois has just a better season than Louisville this last season. NIU was a solid group of 5 team, maybe not quite as good as Western Kentucky, and then Northwestern maybe in a similar tier to Kentucky. So kind of a close call between those 3 states in my opinion, and you could even loop Colorado into that mix. We're in a similar tier here, but I think I'm comfortable with the order I came up with. Getting into the top 15, we have the state of Florida right there at number 15, sort of one of those mega states in terms of the amount of FBS teams you have and FBS programs, but you had some bad in this state this season. Florida State, FIU, UCF, FAU, all teams that really weigh this state down with how bad and how disappointing they were. I mean, UCF and Florida State had real expectations. South Florida also had expectations, kind of underwhelmed a little bit. They had a really tough schedule though, but definitely not what they had imagined or pictured this season. But it was Miami and Florida that truly carried this state to get as high as they are on this list. Miami was a really solid team that ended up fizzling out towards the end of the year, and Florida ended up being a team that not a lot of people wanted to play at the end of the year. I think you could argue that Florida might even be a little bit too high based on where they are, but I do think that with the strong finish that Florida had, and with South Florida maybe playing a bit of a difficult schedule, that is an appropriate spot. At number 14, we have the state of Kansas, where you just had 2 really solid teams, and that's the reason they're here. Now, there is some wasted potential. Kansas lost some games they shouldn't have. They end up finishing the season very strong and beating all those Big 12 contenders towards the end of the year. Kansas State was good enough in the Big 12, however, to get this state up this high, and this is basically just what happens when you don't have any bad teams weighing the state down, and that was the case for the state of Kansas this last season. I know some people might not love this ranking because they might be a little bit lower on Kansas, might rate them a little worse, but the way I look at Kansas is just the way they were able to finish the season was pretty strong, and they were a team that not a lot of people wanted to play toward the end of the year. At 13th, we have the state of Alabama. Now, Alabama typically gets carried pretty hard by the Crimson Tide, and in this case, I'd say they're still the top team in this state, but they definitely had a bit of a down year with a couple more losses than they typically take. So it was the other schools that we look to in this state to carry them. South Alabama ends up winning a bowl game, having a nice season, but it was Jacksonville State with the biggest contribution of winning a conference title and having a really nice year. And outside of that, Auburn and Troy had a bright spot here and there, but ended up missing a bowl game, and UAB was really bad. So there was certainly some good in this state, and there was some pretty bad in this state, but a little bit in the middle, and not any truly elite team this year in this state either, I think. So Alabama at spot number 13, when in previous years you'd be talking about them in some pretty elite company near the top of a list like this. At number 12, we're going to have the state of Arizona. The Sun Devils winning the Big 12, getting into the college football playoff, nearly beating Texas, being a really good team, pretty much wire to wire, was one of the reasons that this state gets all the way up here to number 12. It's the Arizona Wildcats, however, that hold this ranking back a little just because they underwhelmed. They disappointed. If you were talking about this in the preseason, you would have thought Arizona State would be the team holding this state back, but it ends up being the Wildcats, who did still win a few conference games here and there, but overall just did not get it done when it counted, and that's why Arizona is at number 12. And finally, at number 11, just one spot outside of the top 10, we have the state of Louisiana, where LSU was a solid SEC team that did have to go through the SEC, and so maybe even a little better than their record indicated, but Louisiana was in the conference title game in the Sun Belt. Tulane was in the conference title game in the American Conference. So they had some really solid teams at the top. And then even Louisiana Monroe and Louisiana Tech, they didn't have terrible seasons. They both ended up finishing at 5-7. Louisiana Tech actually got to play in a bowl game, and Louisiana Monroe had a resurgent year for what there usually is a big liability. So yeah, some not great schools in this state for this last season, but nothing that's going to drag down the state rating too bad. And I do like the fact that there were 3 really solid teams here. So that gets Louisiana pretty good grade and gets them up to the number 11 spot. Coming in at number 10, we have the state of Oregon, where the Ducks carried this state pretty hard this year. There wasn't nothing from Oregon State. There were a few bright spots the Beavs had, a few nice wins. They beat Washington State, they beat Purdue, they beat Colorado State, but some ugly losses from the Beavs. They end up missing a bowl game by a game, but it was the Ducks who had a really phenomenal season. They go undefeated, they win a Big Ten title. That pulls a ton of weight here, and the Beavs don't hold them back too much. So pretty much single-handedly getting it to be a top 10 state is the Oregon Ducks. And then at number 9, we have the state of Pennsylvania, where Penn State didn't have quite as good of a season as the Ducks did. They end up making a deeper playoff run because they got a better playoff draw, but it was really Pitt that ended up starting 7-0, losing 6 in a row at the end, which is pretty crazy. But at least Pitt made a bowl game, won a couple more games than the Beavs with a tougher schedule. And so that's the reason that the state of Pennsylvania gets that spot, one above the state of Oregon, even though Oregon won that head-to-head against Penn State. At number 8, we got the state of Iowa, where Iowa State and Iowa just showing if both teams have really solid to good seasons and you only have 2 teams in your state, that can take you pretty high, all the way up to number 8, where Iowa State was in the Big 12 title game. Iowa ends up winning 9 games, getting to a bowl game, just losing to Missouri, but a really solid year from both of these teams, especially when you consider the fact that Iowa State inflicted Iowa with a loss there. Still a really solid season, and the best season in Iowa State football history, arguably, this last year. At number 7, we've got the state of Georgia, where you've got some really good in the Georgia Bulldogs. They make the playoffs. They do lose their opening game in the playoffs. You've got some solid. Georgia Tech ends up going 7-6. They had a really brutal schedule they had to battle through. Georgia Southern was a really solid team in the Sun Belt, nearly made the Sun Belt championship game this last season. But then you just have the really bad that ends up dragging the state down and pinning them at 7 in Georgia State and Kennesaw State, both just not being very good teams at all this last season. And so that's why the number 7 spot is where Georgia gets, and they are one spot behind Ohio. Ohio contains the national champions of Ohio State, which does give this state a pretty significant boost and gets them up to number 6. You also consider the fact that Ohio and Miami of Ohio, both in the MAC title game. Ohio wins the MAC title. Bowling Green and Toledo were also really solid MAC schools. And then there's Cincinnati, who wasn't the worst. They do end up missing a bowl game, but they weren't a terrible team that drags this state rating down too much. There's the bad that always drags the state of Ohio down in these lists, though, which is Kent State and Akron. And so those schools certainly factor in here. And all those things, I think, combined for the number 6 ranking, which is not bad for Ohio. Coming in at number 5, though, we have the state of Indiana. Notre Dame and Indiana both making the college football playoffs this last season, both having really outstanding years. Notre Dame makes the run all the way to the national title game and loses, and that's the really, really good. But then on the flip side of the coin, you had the really, really bad, which was Purdue and Ball State. Ball State was the second worst team in the MAC. Purdue was the worst team in the Big Ten. So that's really not good, and I know some people are going to point out that Ohio State did beat Indiana and Notre Dame this last season, but I don't really think that necessarily gives that state the advantage, especially because the state of Ohio also has 2 really bad teams anchoring them down in Kent State and Akron, and I value the fact that 2 teams from this state made a playoff. I feel like that's a really impressive feat here, and so that's why they're going to get the 5 spot. At number 4, we will have the state of Tennessee, where the Volunteers make a playoff run. Memphis ends up winning a lot of games and being an impressive team, one of the hottest teams at the end of the season, going 11-2. Middle Tennessee is the weak link here. They're a bad team, but Vanderbilt turns in a pleasantly surprising season. They were a good team, and I'd say overall a very impressive year from the state of Tennessee, where they finally were able to put it back all together. Vanderbilt, typically a pretty weak link for this state, was able to be a net positive this last season, and so that's why the state of Tennessee able to get a spot that's probably a little bit higher than something that they are used to. So they get spot number 4, and we start to get into the top 3, which is very exciting. At number 3, we are going to have South Carolina. South Carolina with Clemson, South Carolina, Charlotte, and Coastal Carolina. Charlotte obviously being the weak link here. They still end up finishing 5-7, which is pretty solid by their program standards. Coastal Carolina loses in the bowl game, goes 6-7, ends on a tough streak, but still making a bowl game. Really, they're just holding it together because South Carolina and Clemson both had really awesome years. Clemson wins the SEC, makes the college football playoff. South Carolina misses by a couple spots. They do end up losing that bowl game, but they were a really hot team at the end of the year and a really good team. So there's no truly bad like a Middle Tennessee or a Ball State or a Purdue that is holding this state back as much as Tennessee and Indiana are being held back. And so that is going to take us to number 2, which is the surprise state of the season. And that is going to be New York. I cannot express enough that New York was a state that was totally not on my radar as a team or a state that would threaten to be near the top of this list. And yet, here they are. They've got Army, they've got Syracuse, and they've got Buffalo, and all three teams just had outstanding seasons where they beat expectations. Buffalo wins 9 games in Pete Lembo's first season as head coach. In Fran Brown's first season as Syracuse's head coach, they win 10 games, and for a little bit there, they threatened to make the ACC title game. They just were on the wrong end of a few ones. And then there's Army. They win the American Conference in their first year in the conference and end with a bowl win. Just some extremely impressive stuff. There is no weak link in the state of New York, and they had a fantastic season this last year. And that takes us to the #1 spot, which is also the state that has the most FBS programs, which in my opinion makes this ranking even more impressive, and that is the state of Texas. You look at what the state of Texas accomplished this last year, it was pretty phenomenal. You had the Texas Longhorns and SMU both making the college football playoff. Then outside of that, you had Baylor, Texas Tech, Sam Houston, Texas State, Texas A&M, TCU, all winning at least 8 games this last season. And that's especially impressive when you consider a lot of these teams played each other. So they were inflicted losses by each other automatically. All those teams won at least 8 games. North Texas and UTSA still made bowl games despite not being in that group. And then outside of that, you're talking about UTEP and Houston and Rice, who, yes, they all missed bowl games, but Houston was a pretty solid team to miss a bowl game. They won some games late in the year. We're starting to figure some stuff out. UTEP, really bad. Rice also wasn't very good, but when you consider that there's only a few weak links here and so many strong teams in this state, to me it's kind of a no-brainer that Texas gets the top spot in this list. The state of Texas takes the crown for 2024 as the best college football state. That does it for this video. That was all 50 states ranked by their college football teams for 2024. Let me know down in the comments what you think of my ranking and how you would change it. This is going to be a little subjective, I think, when you're comparing these states and how you weigh certain things. And so let me know down in the comments maybe what your top 5 is or what your top 10 is, what you think my list should be. Like I said, that's all I got for you guys. Got a little bit more content coming out later this week, so I'll see you guys later this week.